Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Lauren, you may also call me Lo, and today I'm bringing you a full detailed summary of everything that happened in A Court of Thorns and Roses, also known as ACOTAR by Sarah J. Maas. So I noticed that Allie from Hardback Hoarder and Becca from Becca in the Books both created detailed summary videos for House of Earth and Blood, which is the first book in the Crescent City series by Sarah J. Maas. So I thought it'd be fun to make one for the ACOTAR series. There are 2 more books that are supposed to come out and 4 books currently released. So I thought I could just kind of slowly make one for each book, and then by the time the 5th and 6th books come out, they'll all be out. Hopefully a helpful resource for you if you don't have time or don't feel like rereading the books in order to catch up for the next one. I feel like everybody has read this book at this point, and this isn't necessarily a video that's geared toward people who haven't read this book. If you do watch this video and you haven't read the book, I'm going to spoil the crap out of it. So definitely don't stick with me here if you plan on ever reading the book, but if you don't ever plan on reading the book and you just want to know what it's about, you're welcome to stick around. There will be timestamps in this video, so you can skip around as you like. If you've been here before, you know that I'm in a slightly different place. I usually sit on the chair back there to film my videos, but my bookcases are over here. My desk is where I'm sitting now, and I wanted to film here because I have a monitor and I've actually written out the entire summary of this book, which is the only way I think I could film this video. So I will not be making eye contact with the camera the entire time. I hope that's okay. I will do my best. If you are new to this series and you still want to read the book, you can stick around until the timestamp that says the setup is over, because that's essentially as far as the summary or the synopsis on the back of the book will take you. With all that said, let's get started. So our main character's name is FEYRE, and she is a human. She lives in the human realm, which is south of the fairy realm. I will insert a map here just to make that very clear. And FEYRE's village is kind of right on the very northern kind of border of the human realm, so she's very, very close to the fairy realm. The fairy realm is called PRYTHIAN, and FEYRE lives with her father and 2 sisters, Elaine and Nesta. Elaine is the oldest, and she's kind of like the meek, gentle, kind sister. Nesta is the middle sister. She's a bit snarky, and she and Elaine are very close, and Nesta's always kind of trying to protect Elaine. FEYRE's family was a wealthy merchant family, but they've had a fall from grace and have lost their wealth and are essentially living in poverty. FEYRE's father was hunted down by creditors when all of this happened, and they kind of beat the crap out of him and left him with a severely maimed leg, which has basically prevented him from providing for his family. The only other notable character at this point is Isaac Hale, who's not really integral to the plot at all, but he is the guy that FEYRE is sort of seeing and sleeping with when the book starts. FEYRE's family basically relies on her to provide for them, so she spends a lot of time in the forest, which is highly dangerous because of its proximity to the Fey realm. In general, the family isn't very grateful or appreciative of what FEYRE does for them, but she does it because her mother asked her to take care of the family on her deathbed. So one day FEYRE is out hunting and she sees a doe. She's kind of stalking the doe, and suddenly a huge wolf goes after the doe and starts like eating the doe. Based on the size of the wolf, she wonders if the wolf is actually like a fairy in disguise, and she has kind of a deep hatred for fairies. So she decides to just try to kill the wolf. She has 1 ash arrow, which are supposed to kill Fae, and she uses that to strike the wolf, and the wolf dies. So she skins the wolf for its pelt, leaves the body in the forest, and takes the doe and the wolf pelt back home for food and hopefully so she can sell that wolf pelt. So a few days later, a fairy in like wolf-ish form shows up at her door, totally terrifies her entire family, and basically tells Feyre that she has breached the treaty between humans and fairies by killing a fairy, and she must give her life for the life of the fairy that she killed. A life for a life. She has two options. Essentially, the first option is that she can be killed, and the second option is that she can go and live in PRYTHIAN for the rest of her life in exchange for having killed this fairy. So Feyre basically leaves everything behind and travels to PRYTHIAN to spend the rest of her life there. So the fairy, whose name is Tamlin, takes her to his large, luscious manor in a place where it's basically eternal spring, and she learns that he is High Lord of the Spring Court. Now I'm gonna quickly run you through the court system of the fairies, because I think this is a good time to do that. So PRYTHIAN, the fairy realm, is divided into 7 courts. There are 4 seasonal courts and 3 solar courts. The seasonal courts are spring, summer, autumn, fall, obviously. And these solar courts are dawn, day, and night. Feyre basically finds herself living in the spring court with the High Lord of the Spring Court, who's basically in charge of that part of PRYTHIAN. And to her surprise, she's not imprisoned or tortured. She's basically told that she can just live in this house until she dies. She's given everything that she could possibly want, and she's essentially living a life of luxury compared to her life in poverty with her family. Feyre is basically very skeptical of this entire situation. She doesn't trust fairies. She has been told her whole life that fairies are cruel, they're essentially evil. And so she kind of very hesitantly starts to kind of explore the estate. And on the estate, she meets 2 new characters. So she meets Lucien, who is kind of the second in command for the Spring Court, and he and Tamlin are best friends. And Lucien happens to be the son of the High Lord of the Autumn Court. Feyre also meets Alice, who is a servant. Like I said, Feyre is basically skeptical of everything and everyone, and she starts to learn that things are a bit amiss in the Spring Court. For one, everyone in the household wears masks, masquerade ball masks, and the masks are magically welded to their faces. They cannot take these masks off. She learns that this is due to a blight in the land, basically a curse that is affecting the way that magic can be used, and is also kind of magically keeping these masks on everyone in the Spring Court's faces. Tamlin is actively searching for a cure and also fears that the blight could spread to the human realm, which freaks Feyre out because her family is right on the other side of that border. Eventually, Feyre confesses to Tamlin that she's really worried about her family because she was basically the sole provider for her family, and now she's gone. And Tamlin reassures her that her family is being taken care of. Feyre has a lot of spare time on the estate. She's not expected to work, and she becomes irritated because Tamlin is very much trying to befriend her. Tamlin buys her painting supplies, which is a hobby that she had in her life in the mortal realm, but she wasn't really able to afford the supplies and didn't really have the time because she was providing for her family. So it's kind of a rather big gesture. She also doesn't know how to read, and when Tamlin finds that out, he tries to teach her. She does begin to warm up and become friends with Tamlin and Lucien, but she does realize that they're definitely keeping her in the dark about a lot of the problems that are occurring due to this blight on the land. The blight is also causing these monsters to roam around, and Tamlin has to go out and fight them regularly. When she expresses her concerns to Lucien about the blight and what's going on and starts to ask him questions, he suggests that she traps a Suriel. A Suriel is a dangerous and malevolent type of fae that will answer your questions truthfully if you catch it. However, it can also kill you. Lucien tells her that he will act as backup if anything goes wrong, and she sets out to trap a Suriel. This is a secret between Lucien and FEYRE because if Tamlin found out, he would be super pissed because he is pretty protective of FEYRE. So FEYRE goes out, she manages to trap the Suriel, which is an impressive feat, and she learns that there's another fairy realm called Hybern. Hybern is ruled by a king who resents that the fairies in PRYTHIAN have a treaty with humans, and 100 years ago sent a spy to PRYTHIAN to kind of infiltrate the courts. Before the Suriel can tell FEYRE much more, they are attacked by Naga. Naga are another species of fairy that like to kill and torture mortals. So FEYRE's in trouble. Before she starts running, she risks her life essentially to save the Suriel who's trapped in a net. Lucien is nowhere to be found while all of this is happening, and Tamlin eventually shows up and rescues FEYRE. But things with the Blight keep getting worse, and it's becoming more and more clear. For one, a Summer Court fairy shows up on the property with his wings cut off, basically bleeding to death, and while Tamlin and FEYRE try to save him, he does eventually die. FEYRE also keeps overhearing Tamlin and Lucien talk about this she who seems to be responsible for the Blight. FEYRE eventually learns that the she that they're talking about is Amarantha, who has declared herself High Queen of Prythian. Over time, FEYRE and Tamlin become closer and closer, and Tamlin eventually admits to FEYRE that he has glamored her to only see him, Lucien, and Alice on the property when there are actually many fairies on the property. In addition, Alice, who had looked kind of like a human to her, actually looks very different from a human and has this like bark-like skin. One night, Tamlin tells FEYRE that she must stay in her room and cannot come out until morning under any circumstances. He tells her that a celebration called CALANMAI is happening, and it's essentially a celebration of the beginning of spring in Prythian and in the human world. And it requires Tamlin, as High Lord of the Spring Court, to go through a ritual which will kind of regenerate his magic. FEYRE is curious and dislikes being told what to do, so she leaves the manor and goes to check out the CALANMAI celebration. At the celebration, FEYRE is kind of cornered by three fairies who seem to have bad intentions. She seems to be in a pretty bad situation until she's saved by a fairy who she describes as the most beautiful creature she's ever seen. But she has a feeling that her savior might also have bad intentions, so she quickly kind of gets away from him. Lucien eventually finds her and drags her back to the manor and tells her that the ritual that Tamlin was basically alluding to involves him being consumed by magic, and his sole purpose that night is to find the maiden among a kind of line of female fairies that are lined up. And his magic is supposed to lead him to the correct one, and he is supposed to couple with her in order to complete the ritual. He says that she's really lucky that he found her, because if Tamlin had smelled her, he would have gone straight for her. And this is, and I quote, not a night for lovemaking. FEYRE is embarrassed and basically retreats to her room. But once she stops hearing the CALANMAI music outside, she kind of ventures downstairs and she meets Tamlin, who is still kind of overcome by magic and is not acting like himself. Tamlin basically pins her against the wall and tells her that he smelled her, that it drove him crazy, but that he eventually had to choose another. FEYRE tells Tamlin that she doesn't want to be his leftovers, and Tamlin gets super pissed and basically like bites FEYRE's neck, leaving a bruise. She gets super mad and heads to her room, but also starts to realize that she and Tamlin are developing feelings for each other. As time passes, FEYRE eventually forgives Tamlin, and in the summer, the Spring Court throws a solstice party. During the party, FEYRE and Tamlin kind of leave and admit to each other that they have feelings for each other and also kiss for the first time. The next day, FEYRE, Tamlin, and Lucien are having breakfast, which they always have together, and Tamlin suddenly tells FEYRE to hide behind Lucien. Suddenly, the fairy that had saved FEYRE during CALANMAI shows up, and she finds out that his name is Rhysand, and he is the High Lord of the Night Court. Rhysand is known for being very close to Amarantha, who is the High Queen of Prythian. Rhysand says that he can smell Feyre and threatens to tell Amarantha about her. Then he approaches her and asks her what her name is. Feyre knows that she probably shouldn't give her real name, so she says the first name that she can think of, which is a girl that she grew up with in her village named Claire Bador. Rhysand tells Tamlin and Lucien that he won't tell Amarantha about Feyre if they basically grovel and beg, so they do. But Tamlin realizes that he can't really continue to protect Feyre from Amarantha and from Rhysand and from the blight on the land, so he basically sends her back to her village so that she can be safe from these things. But before she goes, she's kind of in the carriage still on the property. Tamlin comes up to the carriage and tells Feyre that he loves her. Feyre doesn't say it back because she's scared that she won't be able to leave if she does, and she knows that that's what Tamlin wants. When Feyre gets back to her village, she realizes that Tamlin was not lying about having provided her family with everything they could have ever wanted. Her family is no longer living in poverty, and they're living in a huge house and pretty much have everything they could ever want. Tamlin did this by sending a man to the house to ask Feyre's father to get involved in some investments, and he basically gave the family a ton of money without them knowing the true source. Tamlin also glamored Feyre's entire family to believe that Feyre was off living with a distant aunt, but she quickly realizes that the glamour that Tamlin put on her family did not work on Nesta because of her iron will. So Nesta's been pretty much freaking out that Feyre's been like abducted by fairies, and she actually went and tried to save her, but was unable to do so. Since Nesta's the only person who really knows what happened to Feyre, Feyre opens up and tells Nesta everything that happened while she was in Prythian. Feyre also learns that Claire Bador, the girl whose name she gave to Rhysand, was abducted by fairies and her family was killed. Feyre obviously feels awful about this, and after a while, Nesta encourages Feyre to return to Tamlin. Feyre decides to go as long as Nesta promises that if the blight comes to the human realm, she will take the family far away. So Feyre travels back to Prythian by herself and finds a way through the wall that separates the human realm from the fairy realm. She returns to the manor at the Spring Court, and there she discovers that everyone is gone and the manor's been completely ransacked. And the only person who is there is Alice, the servant. Alice tells Feyre that Amarantha put a curse on the Spring Court so that they couldn't tell her the truth. But now it appears that Amarantha doesn't care anymore, and Alice can tell her everything except for one thing that Amarantha evidently still wants kept secret. Alice tells Feyre that she can learn the last thing on her own. All she has to do is listen. So it turns out that when the Suriel told Feyre that the King of Hybern had sent a spy to Prythian, that spy was Amarantha. And Amarantha basically went to all the courts and charmed all of the High Lords into trusting her. Amarantha also had a younger sister named Clythia, who fell in love with a human named Jurian during the war between fairies and humans that resulted in the infamous treaty. It turns out that Jurian actually hated fairies and only used Clythia for information. And when he was done using her for information, he killed her and Amarantha found her. So Amarantha developed this like extreme hatred of mortals, and she killed Jurian and basically trapped his soul in a ring. And Jurian's eyeball and soul are stuck in this ring, and he is forever Amarantha's prisoner. After the treaty was put into place, Amarantha and the King of Hybern killed all of their human slaves instead of freeing them, which is what they were supposed to do. As a result, the High Lords of Prythian closed all trade routes with Hybern, and eventually Amarantha convinced all of the High Lords that she was just overcome by grief and just wasn't responsible for her actions. So the High Lords of Prythian eventually did reopen trade routes with Hybern. However, Amarantha took advantage of the opportunity and smuggled armies over to Prythian on merchant ships. Then she organized a ball in which all of the High Lords and their courts were in attendance. She used the ball as an opportunity to basically drug all of the High Lords and steal their magic, leaving them pretty much weak and powerless. As a result, they couldn't fight back when she and her army took over PRYTHIAN, and she was able to name herself High Queen. She built a palace under the mountain in the center of PRYTHIAN and modeled her palace off of Rhysand's court, the Night Court. She also began the Blight by regularly sending creatures, dangerous creatures, to the High Lord's kingdoms who weren't obeying her. Turns out the only High Lord who wasn't obeying her was Tamlin, so he was the only one dealing with those dangerous monsters in his court. Another thing that happened at this ball was that Amarantha offered Tamlin peace if he would agree to marry her. Tamlin not only refused, but said that he'd rather marry a human than marry her, which was a huge blow. As punishment, she welded those masks to the faces of all of the Spring Court members. In addition, she put a curse on Tamlin. Amarantha tells Tamlin that if he can get a human girl who truly hates fairies to fall in love with him within 7 times 7 years, she will restore his powers and remove the blight from PRYTHIAN. One contingency of this curse is that the human girl must have killed a fairy unprovoked in order to prove to Amarantha that she truly hates fairies. So Tamlin spent a lot of time turning his soldiers into animals and having them wander around the mortal lands, but was never successful in getting a human girl to kill one of his soldiers. After a while, he didn't like kind of trying to sacrifice his soldiers for this purpose, so he kind of gave up. However, at some point, he decided to send one more, and that was the one that FEYRE happened to kill. It turns out that if FEYRE had told Tamlin at the carriage that she loved him back, the curse would have been broken, but there was no way for him to tell her that. Alice tells FEYRE that Tamlin and Lucien and the rest of the court have been taken under the mountain by Amarantha. FEYRE doesn't really know what she can do to save Tamlin at this point, but she asks Alice to take her there. When FEYRE gets under the mountain, she sees Claire Bador's body. She's dead, and she's been kind of like put up on a wall for everyone to see. In addition, Amarantha realizes that the girl on the wall is not FEYRE. It comes to light that Rhysand actually identified Claire Bador as the girl that he saw at Tamlin's manor. And when Amarantha asks him why he identified the wrong girl, Rhysand basically tells her that all humans look the same to him. Amarantha asks FEYRE her name and basically threatens to torture Lucien until she gives her the real name. So FEYRE tells her her real name, which is FEYRE Archeron. Then Amarantha gives FEYRE a choice. She can either answer a riddle correctly, and I'm going to read off the riddle because I'm not going to memorize it. The riddle is, there are those who seek me a lifetime but we never meet, and those I kiss but who trample me beneath ungrateful feet. At times I seem to favor the clever and the fair, but I bless all those who are brave enough to dare. By large my ministrations are soft-handed and sweet, but scorned I become a difficult beast to defeat. For though each of my strikes lands a powerful blow, when I kill, I do it slow. FEYRE doesn't know the answer to this riddle, so she has to go with option number 2, which is basically to undergo 3 trials in order to win Tamlin back. So before Amarantha locks FEYRE up, she has her people basically beat the crap out of her, and then she's thrown into a dark, dank cell. Eventually, Lucien shows up and heals FEYRE as much as he possibly can without Amarantha knowing that someone came in and healed her. Eventually, it's time for the first trial, and she's taken to a huge maze made of mud. And inside the maze is the Worm of Midgard, which is like a giant, carnivorous, terrifying worm that's been basically told to kill FEYRE. And the only way out is to kill the worm. But she doesn't have any weapons, she doesn't have anything, she's just in this maze. There are basically a ton of skeletons and human bones in the maze that the worm has left behind. She eventually creates a trap to ensnare and impale the worm, and it works. So she successfully kills the worm, and completes her first trial. However, before she kills the worm manages to bite her arm pretty badly all the way to the bone. So she's thrown back into her cell, and in the cell she develops a pretty terrible infection from the wound that the worm gave her, and she's kind of on the verge of dying. Lucien doesn't show up to heal her again, but Rhysand does eventually show up and basically offers her a deal. Rhysand tells Feyre that he will heal her if she spends a week a month for the rest of her life at the Night Court. She doesn't really have a choice because she's like actively dying, so she takes him up on his offer. In the process of healing Feyre, Rhysand gives her this crazy tattoo, and there's kind of swirls going all the way down her arm, and there's an eye tattooed on her palm. And these are kind of like classic Night Court tattoos. So it's a way for him to basically show everyone that she, in a way, belongs to him now. Later, guards come to Feyre's cell and they take her to this like dirty hallway. And they give her a bucket of water and tell her that she has to clean the hallway. And if the hallway's not clean in a certain amount of time, they've been given orders to torture her. So she starts trying to clean and she quickly realizes that she's been set up for failure. The bucket is full of muddy water and she's just making the hallway dirtier. However, Lucien's mother, the like queen of the Autumn Court, shows up and basically tells Feyre that she owes her because she opted to give Amarantha her name instead of allowing Lucien to be tortured. So she cleans the water in the bucket magically, and Feyre is then able to clean the hallway successfully. A few days later, Feyre is given another impossible task. She's led to a bedroom, and in the bedroom is a fireplace full of like ash and soot, and there are a bunch of lentils in there. So she's told that she has to separate all the lentils from the ash and soot in the fireplace, and that if she misses one, the room's owner will torture her. She is completely unsuccessful with this. It's, again, an impossible task. And eventually Rhysand shows up, and it turns out that it's his room. Since Rhysand's basically on her side at this point, he magically separates out all the lentils, and she's successfully completed her task. Rhysand starts to show up at Feyre's cell every night, and basically drugs her, and then has her dance in like skimpy clothes in front of the entire court, basically to show that he owns her and to piss Tamlin off. Obviously, Feyre absolutely hates Rhysand. When it's time for Feyre's second trial, she's led to basically like a dungeon situation, and she's separated by a fence from Lucien, who's bolted to the ground. On her side of the fence, there are 3 levers. Amarantha basically tells her that she has to pull the right lever. If she pulls the wrong lever, the ceiling of the dungeon will come down and she and Lucien will both die because they'll be impaled by spikes. Written on the wall is a hint about which lever to pull, but Feyre can't read, and so she's kind of left to guess. So she reaches for a lever and she feels this tingling sensation in her arm. So she tries a different lever and she also feels a tingling sensation in her arm. When she reaches for the third lever, she doesn't feel anything. And she realizes that Rhysand is somehow like communicating with her through this tattoo on her arm. So she pulls the one where she doesn't feel any tingling, and it turns out that that is the correct lever. The night before the third trial, Rhysand doesn't drug her, but he does paint her entire body with like swirls that match the swirls on her arm. And he tells Feyre that this is because he doesn't like anybody touching his property. That night, Feyre and Tamlin actually manage to sneak off together, but Rhysand barges in and sends Tamlin away. And Rhysand forcefully kisses Feyre, and then Amarantha barges in. Feyre suddenly realizes that Rhysand kissed her so that it would look like the smears on her body were from Rhysand rather than Tamlin. In the morning, Feyre is brought to her third trial. At her trial, she's told that she has to kill 3 innocent fairies. So there are 3 fairies with like bags over their heads, so she can't tell who they are. And one by one, the bag is removed and Feyre is to plunge an ash dagger into the heart of the fairy. So she kills the first one and she kills the second one. But when the third one's bag is removed, it turns out that it's Tamlin. In that moment, time kind of stops for Feyre, and she remembers that Alice had told her that there was one thing that Amarantha still didn't want her to know, and that all she had to do to find out the secret was to listen. So she thinks back to all the conversations that she overheard in the spring court, and she realizes that multiple times people alluded to Tamlin's stone heart. Feyre thought that this was a figure of speech, but she wonders if he might actually have been cursed by Amarantha with a stone heart. It's kind of her last resort at this point, so she takes the ash dagger and she stabs Tamlin. Thankfully, the dagger hits something hard and Tamlin doesn't die. Suddenly, all the fairies at the trial start demanding that Amarantha break the curse, but Amarantha refuses. She says that she promised to break the curse immediately if Feyre solved the riddle, but she didn't specify the time frame in which she would break the curse if Feyre did the trials. Then Amarantha kills Feyre and the book is over. Just kidding, but she does break all of the bones in Feyre's body, which does kill her. However, right before Feyre dies, she realizes that the answer to the riddle is love, and she whispers love kind of in her dying breath. Suddenly the curse is broken and all of the High Lords of Prythian have their full powers back. Immediately, Tamlin kills Amarantha. Feyre is still dead, but each of the High Lords of Prythian gives her a bit of their magic, and once this process is complete, Feyre is resurrected. However, she is no longer a human, she is now an immortal High Fae. Feyre and Tamlin go back to the spring court, and Feyre's just kind of ravaged by guilt for having killed the innocent fairies and also for being responsible for Claire Bador's death. She has a pretty bleak outlook for her future and is generally kind of deeply depressed. At the very end, Rhysand shows up and Feyre kind of thanks him for what he did for her during this whole ordeal, but Rhysand reminds her that she won't be thanking him when she has to spend a week, a month at the Night Court. That's it for my summary of A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like it and subscribe, and I will see you next time.